Over the course of life, it's likely that you've had the experience of suddenly seeing something very familiar in a very novel way. Or you've been hit with a new way of looking at an old problem, an old relationship, or an opportunity. And clearly, to be a human being means that we gain insight now and then. And sometimes new ways of seeing things happen in a flash after an acute moment of understanding, at other times over a period of time in an unfolding kind of way. But however it comes about, most of us at one point or another in life have thought, aha, I finally get it. Or wow, I see it totally different now. Or amazing, that's been there all along. And such epiphanies can be rather benign, like suddenly figuring out how a confusing recipe works or how to swing that 4-iron. Or they can be monumentally life-changing, like when we see a person for who they really are, or become open to a long-resisted life change or opportunity, or suddenly put the pieces of our life together in a way that brings about meaning and a sense of purpose. But whether realizations are sudden or slow to develop, big or small, affect just one person or a whole slew of people, there's another kind of awakening I began to speak about last week, and that is conversion. And while a potentially confusing, misunderstood, and emotionally laden concept, conversion is an essential thing for us to consider as we journey in our faith. A fellow named Paul and his conversion is an important example for each of us to know. You may remember that last week I shared in some details Paul's transformation from being a militant, rule-driven, rigid persecutor and tormentor of earlier followers of Jesus to one who spent his life preaching and teaching and leading people in fledgling communities of faith directly to Jesus-committed lives. That it's an extraordinary example of just how radically upending conversion can be. Paul's encounter with Jesus and the resultant shift of his faith and worldview not only changed his life, but in fact the course of history. You might even say that Paul and his work to spread the news about Jesus is one reason that we are here at Snowmass Chapel this morning, 2,000 years later. Paul's life and conversion was that big of a deal. While many of us do not experience what Paul did, conversion is just as important for each one of us. You may remember that I talked about what conversion means in some detail, that it means coming into a relationship with God. For Christians, it means coming into a relationship with Christ, or experiencing such a deepening of our relationship with Christ to such a degree that our lives are totally different. The conversion is about an inward, God-driven experience that manifests itself in tangible outward ways. Well, as I mentioned last Sunday, coming into a relationship with Jesus for the first time, or encountering Jesus in a life-altering way for the 10th time, is not just about saying some words. It's not a formula. It's about a life and a relationship. That often conversion is not a one-shot deal and then we're done, but it's an ongoing experience throughout our life as we move closer and closer and closer to Jesus, sometimes suddenly and sometimes over the course of time. Well, today I would like to get further into this topic and look at some different aspects of conversion than we got into last week. And most of what I spoke about last week is in the bulletin and sermon notes you can look at later. But the first thing I want to take a look at this morning is the issue of what can get in the way of us coming into a relationship with God, or what can get in the way of us having a deepening relationship with Christ. And to help us with this, I want to take a look back at the story of Paul for a moment. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details, but recall that Paul and some of his companions were walking from Damascus, Syria to Jerusalem. That on the way he was blinded by a light. He heard the voice of Jesus, and then he went blind. That 3 days later, his sight came back, and then it reads in the book of Acts, something like scales fell from his eyes. Now, we don't know what these scales were, but we do know that God caused Paul's temporary blindness. God did this, I believe, so that Paul couldn't see anything, so that he would have to truly understand how blind he had been, and that he would have to depend entirely on the help of other people, ironically, people he wanted to persecute. God-induced temporary blindness was part of Paul's conversion experience. That said, it's important to point out that before he met Jesus on the road, Paul was blind in another kind of way. Not because of a physical condition, but due to the way that he insisted on looking at things. You see, before Paul met Jesus, I don't believe he could see God for who God is, nor could he accept what God was up to in the person of Jesus. You might even say that Paul's blindness that inhibited from seeing God, ironically, was due to all of his religious viewpoints, his convictions, and his behaviors. Prior to his conversion, Paul, I believe, had a tough time seeing God because he was too certain about far too many things. He was not open to something new in his life. He was not open to God doing something new. He was not interested in learning anything new or coming to a new understanding about God. In fact, Paul, before he met Jesus, believed that he had it all figured out, that faith is about 613 laws and following them. I doubt he had much of an ability to listen to God, as he was far too often telling people what to do and what to think. He believed it was his role to police and judge the faith of others, hence his trips all over the place persecuting Christians. You might even say that at this point of his life, before he met Jesus, Paul was so full of himself and what he believed was right, there was not much room left in his life for a living, loving, forgiving, and grace-driven God, let alone a Savior. So as we explore our own relationship with Jesus, I think it's important for us to think about Paul before he knew Jesus and the things that got in the way of Paul letting God be God. You see, like Paul, there may be things or thoughts or behaviors or stances or stuff in our own lives that are getting in the way of a relationship with God. And I believe that Paul's story compels us to ask some tough questions that I hope you'll think about that are in your bulletin. But questions such as, what ways do I think? What are some of my behaviors? What are some long-standing sacred cows in my life? What about my life just might be getting in the way of me being open to what God is trying to do in my life? What might I be holding on too tightly? What might I not be paying enough or too much attention to? What are the non-negotiables in my life and in my faith, in fact, that really don't have anything to do with Christ? Such questions and others are vital. You see, it's so important that we're honestly self-aware enough with ourselves to understand how we might be hindering a deepening relationship with Christ. Now, we do this, don't mishear me, the point of this is not so we feel inadequate or bad or less than or guilty, but it's to get clear on who we are so we can open up ourselves for the transforming power of God's Spirit in our lives. Years ago, I had the privilege of speaking with a woman who was part of a parish. We were talking about this very subject. She said she wanted to get closer to Christ, but something was getting in the way. And we talked in some detail. And this, in essence, is what she said to me. Robert, I love Jesus, but when I think of Jesus, or I say his name, or I pray to him, I feel like one of those people. You know, like a fundamentalist. Someone who's narrow and rigid. I'm a Christian, but when I say Jesus, it makes me think of someone who's holier than thou, someone who comes across as knowing it all and acting as if I was like them, I'd be okay. Honestly, Robert, I've been a Christian all my life, but when I say Jesus, I want to cringe. It was an extraordinary discussion. And we talked and we prayed, and she came to me a few weeks later. And she had an epiphany. Said, Robert, I've been letting other people take Jesus away from me. I'm not going to let that happen anymore. Jesus isn't theirs to take. I've been hung up on the wrong thing. I'm letting Christ back into my life, and I'm not going to worry about other people or what they think. It was then that her relationship with Christ deepened in profound ways. You might even say that scales fell from her eyes because she finally let go of labels and stereotypes of Christians and preconceived notions and narrow definitions that were infringing upon her ability to see what Christ was trying to do in her life. It was an extraordinary thing for her to go through. Think about what might be hindering your relationship with Christ. Not to feel bad or guilty, but to open yourself up more to his transforming power. But aside from looking at hindrances, I want to look at some other aspects of the conversion, some of which I got into last week. Remember, I said that it's God who does the converting. We don't convert ourselves, God does. Coming into a relationship with Christ or into a deeper relationship is different for different people. Sometimes it happens in a flash, sometimes over the course of years. Certainly, it's not a matter of just saying some words and then you're done. It's about a changed life. But today I want to get into just a few more things about conversion that are important for us to keep in mind. First, by definition, a life of faith, our journey in faith, our relationship with God, our spiritual lives, whatever you want to call it, are intended by God to be communal. We may know this, but it's important to repeat. While our journeys are personal and individual and unique, our faith, our spirituality is not about me and what I can pull together that feels right. It's not about me alone. It's about a community and living in a community of faith. Faith is communal. Key to Paul's conversion was the involvement of other people. Paul's companions guided him after the light blinded him. A fellow named Ananias, who was a follower of Jesus, was critical to Paul's transformation. Through Ananias, God restored Paul's vision. Ananias was key to Paul's adjustment period when Paul could see again and realize the enormity of what happened. And then in our reading today, we hear about the conversion of Cornelius and some of his family members and friends. The whole thing happened communally. The bottom line, we need other people to walk with us in our faith. We cannot do faith alone in isolation. It has got to be done in community. It is through other people of faith our relationship with God happens and deepens. It's in the midst of a communal faith that we learn more and more about God. We're led to new ways of thinking and being. We're sustained in the challenges of faith. Said another way, conversion is meant to be lived out in community, and being part of a community helps lead to conversion. But aside from this, it's important to remember that conversion is frequently about a shift in the use of our talents and gifts. Conversion means we use our gifts and talents in a new way as we come into deeper and deeper relationships with Christ. Let's look at Paul. This guy was zealous. He was enthusiastic, you might say. That's an understatement. He was very determined, but not in a good way at first. He zealously pursued the destruction of Jesus' followers. We're like Paul. We all have different skill sets and gifts. They can be used for good or bad, for what's right or unjust, for what's in alignment with God or not. And what's interesting is that when Paul met Jesus, Jesus didn't get rid of Paul's intensity. He shifted Paul's use of his intensity. The focus and expression of Paul's intensity dramatically shifted. Rather than using his zealous nature to destroy, Paul's gift of intensity was used by God to spread the story of Jesus all over the Mediterranean. I believe it's highly unlikely that someone without such intensity that Paul had could have succeeded or endured the obstacles of spreading the gospel in those days. So Paul meets Jesus. He uses his gift of zealous intensity and shifts its use 180 degrees. Well, we, like Paul, have our own God-given talents and gifts. And when we meet God for the first time, or our relationship deepens in some profound way, often the way that we know it is we feel a call to use our gifts and talents in a brand new way. So some questions to think about. What are my gifts and talents? How am I using them? Am I using them in any way that is directly related to serving Christ? Any way that is tangible for God? What would that look like? The thing is, the closer we get to Christ, the more likely we're going to ask such questions. How can I use my gifts for God? And the ironic thing is, the more we ask such questions, Christ is likely to use such questioning to draw us closer to him. Just a couple more here. Another characteristic of conversion is that our lives begin to increasingly resemble the way. Now, before Paul's conversion, followers of Jesus weren't called Christians. They weren't called Christians for some time. They were referred to as people who followed the way or were committed to the way of God, the way of Jesus. And the way included things such as humility and forgiveness and servanthood and worship and traveling lightly in life and sharing the story of Christ and prayer and gathering and love. And as people in these fledgling communities moved closer and closer to Christ, their lives began to reflect these things by how they acted. As I've mentioned, conversion is not just about an inward experience, but it's about a God-driven inward attitude transformation that precipitates outward behavioral change. Said more simply, the closer we are to Christ, the more our lives look like Christ, because Christ is changing our values and our perspectives and our priorities as a result of that relationship. And finally, the last thing I just want to touch on quickly regarding conversion today comes from the stories of Paul and Cornelius. We know the story of Paul. Imagine the transformation of somebody that went around persecuting, arresting, torturing, wanting people dead, to somebody who writes 1 Corinthians 13, love. What a transformation. And then there's the story of Cornelius. Now, what a lot of people point out is that Cornelius, he had his life changed by Christ, but what's interesting is that Cornelius, as a lot of people point out, was one of the least likely people to ever have a relationship with God. He was a Roman guy. He was a military guy. He didn't want anything to do with God. But that's exactly what happened. So the stories of Paul and Cornelius, along with so many other stories in our world today, point to something that is so important for us to remember when it comes to faith. No one's beyond God's reach. Don't give up on anybody, ever, when it comes to them coming into a relationship with God. Total change, transformation, conversion can happen to anybody at any time. So for goodness sakes, don't ever give up on another person. And never give up on yourself. If you lost it, it can happen. Well, there's so much more to say about this topic. And I really hope that you're going to take these notes from the last 2 weeks. You're going to think about it, talk about it, debate, discuss, ponder, pray. What I want to emphasize through this very short series I've done is that where we are as people and where we are as a chapel, where we are with Jesus is fundamental. Nothing more important. That's why this topic of conversion. It is all about where we individually and collectively are with Christ. And when it's all said and done, if the one thing that happens to you and to me from being part of Snowmass Chapel is that we move closer and closer and closer and closer to Christ, and that if because of that relationship our lives are spent serving people through love-based action based on that relationship, then I believe this chapel in the middle of these Rocky Mountains in this small village of Snowmass will have been faithful to God's calling. You see, from where I sit, everything else about this chapel is negotiable, not worth sweating over, and really doesn't matter in the long run. Simply stated, Christ and loving people through action. That's it. Aha. That's it. Aha. Christ loving people through action as a result of that relationship. It's the whole deal. And I pray that it'll be more and more of the whole deal of this chapel.